This chapter, negatives of the book, Negative Psychoanalysis for the Living Dead, which is Dead Together, Love Hurts, deals with death drive as social drive. And with this chapter, I was trying to expose the negative core of the social bond, not only of the subject, but also the social bond. And if the death drive is at the core of a subject, it also means that it's at the core of sociality, a social bond. So not only within us, but also in between us, something that connects us and disconnects us at the same time. And using maybe existential term, being towards death, it's not only individual being, but also social being is also towards death and defined by its opposite, by its limit, by its absence. And this lack, nothingness at the core of subjectivity and at the core of sociality is something that it is rupture, but it's something that connects and disconnects at the same time. It connects by disconnecting or disconnects by connecting. And at the same time, something that holds us in common and something that makes the social bond impossible. So what is inside, not only of each of us, of subjects, but also of the interconnectivity between us, is radical negativity. I can call it that way, lack or nothingness. And it means that it's painful. It's not, there is some kind of bliss and fusion of ours at the core of what connects us, but the radically opposite, which we feel once we touch this core of connection between us. It feels as pain and destruction and destruction and anxiety. It's really convenient to quote myself, except for I feel like an idiot. But so it's not only rupture between something that constitutes subject, the life, the narrative of subject's life, of subject existence. So rupture represented here by everything except for those lines, like nothingness, the rupture, the nothing that is at the core, and that is constitutive to the subject existence and life narrative, something that disconnects and connects at the same time the parts of the self as the self exists, keeps on existing. And using maybe Lacanian term that McGovern uses, and this chapter relies a lot on McGovern's interpretation of the death drive. He claims that it's social. So Lacan's interpretation of Lacanian interpretation of the death drive can be that it's the repetition of lack, the repetition of lack that constitutes the subject that is initially post-traumatic and constituted around the rupture. I would even say the absence of herself, the absence of the subject at the core of the presence of the subject. And in Lacanian interpretation, it would be the repetition of the lack. Here's the lack and here's the lack. The repetition of ruptures, the death drive as repetition compulsion, falling into the lack, into the nothingness of oneself at the core of the subject. And the life story would be covered by the fantasy. So the fantasy of the possibility of coherence of self, or using Lacanian terms, it's we feel longing for establishing some kind of coherency or looking for something that we think we lost, but it was never there. It's already always absent. And it is the lack or the loss, the initial loss, that it was always there, and it's impossible to redeem it, to feel it. And we are driven by longing to return to this repetition of the lack, returning to the lack, to the traumatic core of the self, to the constitutive loss. And subject can be seen as self-wounding subject, and that repeats the process of self-wounding. And by touching the core of who the subject really is, of who we are, this is, and feels anxiety. This is Heidegger's anxiety when we discover the nothingness at the core of Dasein, of the subject existence, which feels like anxiety. Anxiety for Heidegger is death while alive. And for Lacan, too, who takes it from Heidegger. And anxiety is the only effect that doesn't lie. So it's touching the core of the emptiness at the core of the subject. And with sociality, we can say it's similar. There is lack not only at the core of the subject, but also at the core of the connectivity of between us, not only within us, but also in between us, at the core of a social bond, which means it's traumatic and it's painful. There is nothingness that connects us here. There is nothing. And at the same time, this nothingness disconnects us. It represents the rupture. And there is illusion of coherency. There is fantasy that covers the initial lack, the rupture that constitutes social bond. It might be ideology, it might be different types of ideology like politics, or my favorite example is conventionally positively oriented pop psychology, which covers the rupture, representing, for example, idea of healthy relationship that not supposed to hurt, which is just, for me at least, pretending that covering this core, the impossibility of the connection between the rupture at the core of the social bond. So conventional psychology offers the idea that this lack can be redeemed, the lack can be filled. There might be actual harmony there, and relationship between people that won't hurt. But during the traumatic moments within relationship with people, we expose this rupture when we fight with each other, for example. I think things we can say to each other, but then later we would pretend that it was just the exception, a deviation, it's not truth. So this lack exposes itself from time to time, but in order to sustain the other, in order to be with the other, to maybe to have the social bond, we need to cover it too, because it's impossible to basically face it. It's very traumatic. And so not only the emptiness is at the core of who we are, but also at the core of the sociality. And this anxiety, for me, that for Heidegger is the basis of individualization, and for depressive realism, the depression is something that when we look inside of us, we would discover it feels as depression or it feels as anxiety. It has to do with looking inside of yourself, or seeing the truth of yourself, something going within oneself. In existentialism, in the position of depressive realism. But for me, it's not only and for Heidegger, for example, being with others, the social bond, with the concept of a Mitsein, like being with others, it would mean rather when you dissolve yourself in others and you get rid of anxiety. Others are like shelter from when you hide from an anxiety that otherwise you would notice if you look inside of yourself. For me, this anxiety is not only looking within oneself, not revealing the truth of oneself, which is the absence of oneself, but also being with others, the connection or the rupture that connects with others. So anxiety is not only within us, but also in between us. When we touch not only the core of who we are, but also when we touch the core of the connectivity with others. Another quote. So McGovern would talk about sacrificing as the embodiment, the idea of sacrifice as embodiment of the death drive, and presupposes the repetition of lack or the repetition of loss. And it's he sees it as, he comprehends it as the practice that sustains a social bond. So if there is nothing that constitutes us, if there is nothingness at the core of who we are, meaning it is the real us, the absence of us, then it is also something that connects us, or in between us, something, nothingness that we hold in common, something that constitutes the social bond. And the repetition of in various rituals presuppose sacrifice is embodiment of the death drive on the level of a social bond. And we can feel it in any how we comprehend any pro-social act or noble human quality. It presupposes this negation of self-sacrifice, like you sacrifice yourself, you reveal nothing that you are, and this is this nothingness that you sacrifice to the other, which is, we can say, the nature of love and any pro-social act, which is suicidal. It presupposes self-negation and revealing oneself as nothing, and through this nothing connecting with the other, or sharing the other, sharing nothingness with the other, or embracing the nothingness which at the same time connects to the other. And ashes to ashes. The important thing to point out is the absence of enjoyment, because while McGovern talks about death drive as social drive, in his book Enjoying What We Don't Have, the political project of psychoanalysis, he would claim, which I respect him a lot for that death drive is at the core of the social bond, not only of the individual, and he truly tries to comprehend death drive as a central drive, as something that is there to stay. It's central, and unlike others who would, whenever they approach the concept of a death drive, they would normally approach it as in order to escape from it, or to defeat it, somehow escape the tragedy of the death drive. So he would do the opposite. He would actually reestablish the centrality of the death drive as inevitable. There is nothing you can do, basically. But at the same time, and I respect him a lot for talking about death drive as social drive, which we can say already Sabina Spielrein did, talking in her initial version that precedes Freud's version as the social death instinct, as the has to do with we psyche, or the collective psyche. But what McGovern does is, death drive for him is basically secondary interest. He mostly discusses it in the context of how enjoyment works. And it's a dangerous context for the death drive because it's positive context. And whenever you talk about death, about the enjoyment, and mention death drive in its content, you comprehend it as the part of as the structural part of enjoyment. And his interest was and is how to see the death drive operating within the structure of enjoyment. So it's enjoyment what he mostly deals with, and not the death drive. For me, it's the opposite. I think I'm not trying to, at least not mentioning enjoyment at all. Just death drive and no enjoyment, because as I was already explaining with the concept of jouissance, that it's dangerous to admix enjoyment, or to consider enjoyment while we're talking, and we actually want to establish the centrality of the death drive, because we cannot see suffering once enjoyment is mentioned. Suffering would be seen as in dialectical relationship with enjoyment. Either there's something that, like for McGovern, death drive is something that is needed for enjoyment. We cannot enjoy if there is no loss or luck. But for me, I don't consider enjoyment at all. And I think it's, without considering it, it's better to comprehend what is the subject of the death drive, the subject who is not hedonistic subject, who is not in pursuit of enjoyment. And talking about enjoyment is not relevant to this subject, or to this part of subjectivity. So I'm trying to rescue the death drive and reestablish its centrality in this chapter and the rest of the chapters and the rest of my life. And the other parts of this chapter that we'll consider talk about this month is next week, the negative dialectics of the individual and society. I will try to show how there are two illusions, the presence illusion of the existence of subject constitutes the illusion or is in negative dialectical relationship with the illusion of presence of the subject, and how both of them are driven by the death drive. And then we'll talk about negative social cognitive neuroscience. We'll try to show using scientific terms how death drive, or what we can call death drive, or negative aspects, constitutes the social bond. And talk also about the attachment theory, how they, without knowing it, how social cognitive neuroscience and attachment theory actually suggest and reveal and show how on the level of neurobiological level, we are constituted, a social bond is constituted negatively. For example, the idea of a social pain that is used in social cognitive neuroscience, but as something to avoid. Like they would claim the social idea of a social pain that it exists. We feel others painful, but for them, they normally use it with the intention to avoid it, somehow to protect ourselves from it. And my claim would be that it's what constitutes the social pain is the only social dimension. It would constitute sociality. We cannot feel the other without, otherwise, if we don't feel longing or pain, or the other is already missing, something that causes the pain. And then we'll talk about the negative and the political. We will discuss how political projects are positive and how, but at the same time, how they are constituted negatively, and at the same time try to avoid this negative core. And during the last meeting of this month, we will actually start talking about negative psychoanalysis finally. Negative psychoanalysis as a social practice, as a social project, the possibility of the negative project of psychoanalysis, as opposed to the positive projects, political or positive projects of ideology. So that's it for me. I will stop recording and talk to you.